And tell the director he should have his head examined. He shouldn't have shot the picture. He should have shot himself.
Jonathan, it's not as bad as all that.
I butchered it. Von Elstein should have been here today. He would have enjoyed this. I have no tension, no timing, no pace, nothing. I took a beautiful, sensitive story and turned it into a turgid, boring movie.
ご機嫌いかがですか？渡辺Danです。And welcome to Industry Rants, where we talk about the state of the entertainment industry. This will be our year-end summation of where the industry stands as of the end of 2019. It's been kind of an interesting year because a lot of the myths that had been built up over the past several years came crashing down. We had a couple of summations of what's going on in terms of box office that kind of pointed to where audiences want to go. And most importantly, we're starting to see the whole world of streaming emerge full force, especially with the new premiere of Disney+. All of this is going to be greatly impacting what's going on in entertainment moving forward. Most of the time when I do these State of the Industries, it's because I'm making them for my students who are currently looking to get into the entertainment industry. This time we're going to do it a different way. Two of my friends that I have known for, well over 40 years, one of them from junior high and one of them from high school, have asked me questions about what's going on in entertainment specifically. And they, as I, started from the same place, loving movies, loving the whole process of watching movies and TV shows and being maybe even over-inspired by them than was perhaps healthy. The first of them is from my friend Rob Blizard. Now, I knew Rob in 7th grade, right before I moved to Tokyo. And he and I spent the better part of Mrs. Maley's math class sitting there exchanging Academy Award quizzes with each other, such as 1947 Best Supporting Actress, and I would write back Celeste Holm, Gentleman's Agreement. So yes, we were that terrible and that geeky. But it did give both of us, I believe, a very, very solid foundation in entertainment, which, because of my experience working for Fremantle and on Baywatch and Family Feud and Price is Right and all that, came to make it so that I found the industry understandable, you know, because perhaps I started so young and I was reading Valley of the Dolls and Carpetbaggers and all of these trashy novels from way too young an age. So here's Rob's question. Dan, you know what a huge, long-time movie buff I am. I must sound off on this new trend of highly acclaimed films made by Netflix or whatever, showing in hardly any theaters before being streamed. I want to see my films at a theater, not on television or a laptop, heaven forbid, or some podcast. Okay, let's address this. This is actually a money question, and it's a money question that finds itself rooted in what's going on with Netflix right now. Netflix as a company benefited severely from perfect timing, and that perfect timing was hitting the market when DVDs had reached that point of saturation. And what do I mean by the point of saturation? The point of saturation comes that time when a technology that's based on art actually starts running out of good, solid new material. What do I mean by running out of prime material? Well, the answer to that is actually quite simple. When DVDs first came on the market at the very end of the 90s, it was a new technology. People had gotten kind of tired of the relatively low quality of VHS, and this presented a way to see movies on a TV device looking fairly spectacular. And over the course of the next 10 to 15 years, you saw pretty much every movie you could possibly want come out. And I'm not only talking about the new stuff, I'm talking about the deep catalog items. And by the time we got to the 2009, 2010, it was at the point where, for those of us who were really into the technology, we were getting to the point where there just weren't that many titles. I've got to tell you, today, I get really excited about the new issue of Murders in the Rue Morgue, the 1932 movie. And trust me, that's not on my top 100 movies. It's way down in the priority list because everything I could possibly want, I already have. And this was not helped by them releasing Blu-rays early. So people weren't even done replacing their old VHS collections with DVDs when Blu-ray came out, and people felt that they were dipping into the well too often. Enter Netflix, which offered the opportunity first to get DVDs without having to go to Blockbuster, without having to pay late fees, with seeming to have everything you could possibly want. Netflix's biggest advantage was that they also hit the market right at the time when online was sufficiently fast to where you could actually stream a movie. So they quickly dropped, well, they haven't really dropped it, but for all intents and purposes, no one thinks of Netflix as a DVD distribution system, except for those of us who are, shall we say, okay boomers. So what ended up happening was that Netflix benefited from that transition. It was the only game in town. So therefore, they were able to amass pretty much every studio, everybody who had a piece of old content that they wanted to repurpose yet again, found a willing buyer in Netflix for its streaming services. But Netflix was perhaps too much of a victim of their own success. And in the process of doing that, they started to, as all companies do, want to make their own product, want to be able to take that largesse that they had done and make sure that they kept that enthusiasm going. It's not that odd because, after all, look at what HBO did. It went from showing movies that were uncut at home without TV commercials or censorship to doing things like their specials, their initial specials, like the one that was the expose of the R.J. Reynolds thing. That was a big all-star vehicle, and then they would do Angels in America and other things that really put them on the forefront of creating new content, which in turn turned into series. And we all know that Netflix wanted to do that too. But there's always a dark side when you forget what your initial success was based on. And a lot of Netflix's original success was based on the fact that they were the go-to place. Now, certainly, it's not as if everybody who was watching Netflix, or even a minority of people who are watching Netflix, really were that excited about watching old episodes of Macmillan and Wife or Murder, She Wrote. But there were enough of them to where Netflix became very easy to be considered a cable replacement for people who wanted almost any kind of programming. Their introduction of House of Cards further cemented that. And then they came up with the whole concept of binge watching. Now, binge watching is not a new concept. Trust me, for those of us who were home video pioneers in the late 70s, we would binge watch. We would videotape an entire series of a show, and then during the summer, we would watch them all back to back so that we wouldn't have to deal with the reruns in season or those times when they would have to run a special because they ran behind in production schedules and all that other stuff. So that wasn't new. But it seemed to catch on. It seemed to catch on with the public. And so Netflix immediately did the Carol Co. And what that meant was that they started looking at that as being their newest and best source of continuing revenue, of keeping themselves relevant. Instead of just having everything available to anybody when they wanted it, now they wanted to dictate what some of the new projects were. And what they did is they started spending an incredible amount of money to get exactly what they wanted. And this coincided with the agencies deciding to do another big push to become their own producers ultimately, but definitely to beef up their project of packaging, which is to take all of the elements of a film, get a percentage of the budget rather than just getting a 10% from their clients who happen to be in the project, and participate in the back end of it because they help put it together, thereby kind of replacing a lot of the development execs and a lot of those middle managers, of which I used to be one. But anyway, they started buying those projects and they started paying top dollar. And the reason I refer to it as Carol Co. is because Carol Co. in the early days of the foreign market and the early days of VHS made a fortune by distributing a lot of B and C titles, and then they started selling those as packages. And they started creating big budget films as the leader of the package. So in order to get Rambo, which was their first big one, where they made a name for themselves by spending $20 million to get Stallone to an exclusive contract per picture, which at that time was about double what anyone else was making. And Stallone was hardly one of the big names at that time. He was considered a little bit of a has-been. Well, Rambo and First Blood were such huge hits that it seemed to justify that. And little by little, Carolco became more focused on their big pictures and not on their bread and butter, which was doing a lot of distribution of these B and C titles with a great project as the lead. And while that worked for a while, especially during the period when they were doing Basic Instinct and Terminator 2, again, getting a lot of publicity for the money they were spending, they became financially unstable, and they got to the point where the failure of Cutthroat Island and Showgirls took them down. And I mean took them down hard. And this is what I believe is happening with Netflix right now. That their process of spending top dollar for every single project that they make has made it so that they are now financially unstable. They owe almost as much in terms of long-term debt as Disney spent to acquire 20th Century Fox. They can't sustain that. This is their only business. They've also successfully gotten rid of the home video business, more or less. It's still there, and it's still quite a lot of money, but not compared to what it was 10 years ago. So it's a big problem, because who are they going to sell their titles to? No one else is there to buy it. Okay, yeah, maybe they can get HBO to do a second run. I don't think so. No, they are kind of stuck with selling to themselves, which is a bad position to be in, especially because one of the challenges with doing something that's a binge watch is that you have no ability to fix something. Now, this is an industry secret, but let's get real here. When you're doing a show, if it's being aired once a week and somehow you have totally jumped the shark on the show and you are in big trouble with it, well, all you need to do is to go backwards a little bit and say, okay, we can't do much with next week's episode, but maybe we can lessen some of the damage of things that are currently happening. And that might mean taking an action scene and extending it a little longer and cutting a scene out completely, or using some kind of a voiceover or some kind of a quick one-day shoot where you cover the fact that you're cutting certain pieces of information out, but you can at least start removing the trouble. If you think about the show Melrose Place, there was a moment when Antonio Zapata Jr. came on board, and they thought he was going to be part of a big, long arc, and he failed. No one was liking him, so they had him fall down the stairs and get rid of him in 3 episodes. You were able to do that. When you're creating 10 episodes as a binge, if audiences hate episode 3 after all the publicity you've done to put out episode 1, they are going to stop watching it. And right now, more than half of the new original series on Netflix, a big chunk of their audience never makes it past episode 3. They never make it to episode 10. Now, in traditional network where something was on every week, on commercial network, it was a very easy solution. You canceled the show. You didn't even finish posting maybe the back 3. You said, okay, 1 and 2, this is as good as it's going to get, cancel it. So you didn't have to spend that extra money. You didn't even have to fill out your initial commitment. Of course, back then it was a 6, 9, 13, 22 commitment on an average show. But with Netflix doing 10 and also being high end, you're looking at $3 million an episode. So that means that you have 7 episodes that are dead assets. And if you're spending $3 million each, that's $21 million you have thrown away from just one show. That's $21 million you will never be able to recoup. Now multiply that out over all the shows they did. So what is Netflix doing? It is quintupling down. Something like The Irishman is problematic because they spent $175 million for that movie. Now, on the one hand, you can say, well, so what? It's going to be a Netflix premiere. Well, okay, then let's work out the numbers. How many new and long-term subscribers should you have to pick up in order to justify that investment if that's the only thing that you're using as a way to entice those people. I know that's not exactly what it will be, but remember, Netflix is hemorrhaging customers in the United States right now. So what they had to do was they had to, that would actually be the equivalent of having almost 400,000 new subscribers who stick with them for 5 years in order to justify that expense, all just by itself for that amount of money. Further, the amount of money they spent, if they were going to do it as a solid theatrical traditional release, when you run the numbers, that's a movie that needs to make almost $1 billion in order to justify the expense that was spent on it. Now, realistically speaking, that means that it's got to be a hit along the levels of one of the Marvel movies. And as much as I love Scorsese, as much as I think he's done a lot of good stuff, this is not that movie. This is not that movie that's going to make that kind of money. So therefore, they were put in a tough position. Because on the one hand, Netflix really wants to look like it's on the cutting edge. And so for a movie like The Irishman to make a huge impact, it really would benefit it to win a lot of awards. Here's the problem. You have a movie that's pokey at best. Okay, maybe I'll be struck by lightning. I don't like The Irishman. Doesn't matter if I don't like it. The fact is that The Irishman is meant for pretty much people like me. Older, people who like these actors and who remember them when they were younger and very rebellious. These are not the actors that most young people are that excited about. They're just not. And so now you have a movie that's 3.5 hours, which means it's longer than Ben-Hur, a little bit shorter than the Ten Commandments and Gone with the Wind, so it's a heavy trudge. And how could it possibly make that kind of money? Plus, when they released it, the tracking, when audiences were leaving it, I can only assume were not highly positive. So this was not a movie that was going to platform from a small, intimate release into a big hit. So therefore, Netflix was in a bad bind, because if they allowed it to play out and they extended the moment before it debuted on Netflix, the word of mouth on it was going to be soft. And that soft word of mouth would make it so that it couldn't use this as a gimme to get more people to subscribe to the service. It wouldn't be that. And remember, they'd already had a stunt with the Orson Welles movies, It's All True, or whatever that thing was, where after 40 years of it not being able to be released, it's finally released to a great big yawn. And as much as Roma made a big impact, it was never going to be a big hit at the box office, nor was it going to open up the way Water for Chocolate did. So therefore, even though it was a gamble for them to release it theatrically, it has pretty much solidified to Netflix that their big number projects are not necessarily ones that they can throw out there and expect to really last and to really grab the box off, to really grab those new subscribers. So they didn't have that option of letting it play out. And yes, that is taking those of us who are older moviegoers and leaving us at a point where we're not getting a chance to see this movie at its highest and best. And this brings up another issue with Netflix, which I'm going to tackle with the next question, which is from my friend Soren. Now, Soren was someone who I met when I was the wrestling manager for the wrestling team. No, I never wrestled because, come on, look at me. And so it was very hilarious to have this fat geek managing the wrestling team, right? It actually prepared me to work on Baywatch, trust me. Me understanding the athletic mindset and how I had no connection with it any place in my life allowed me to be the ideal person to see what worked about it and to understand it intellectually, not just from a publicity standpoint. So it worked. Anyway, here's what Soren asked me. I am canceling several streaming subs at the end of the year. They are very much alike, endless dreck. You know, I wonder how the old studios with 100+ years of history feel about the dreck they put out now. Too facile to pin the blame on superheroes, it's all bad. Don't they feel a bit ashamed deep down? The answer is no, they don't, and that's the problem. And this gets us to a big issue as to why content is such a challenge these days. I'm not going to talk about going all the way back to financial interest and syndication rules creating this problem, even though it did. The bottom line is that Hollywood today, even though the GEs of the world have largely pulled out, and we're again living in a world where at least people basically understand kind of the showbiz mindset. AT&T and Comcast come from having experience in cable and knowing what works. So they're not as bad as having General Electric running NBC for a while there. But it's still somewhat problematic because they don't really understand the mindset. Further, what's happened is there's this tendency to bring in the Harvard MBA clique, the elites of legal, the elites of business, to try to figure out how to make show business work. This was something that began in the 90s, when in order to become a development exec, instead of being someone who had a working knowledge of the motion picture or television industry, they didn't consider that valuable at all. Instead, they wanted someone who had an Ivy League MBA, because it meant that they probably went to an Ivy League school and had friends who were venture capitalists who could thereby provide the industry with much needed cash. And so the concept of making a great movie shifted rather dramatically from looking for great content that wasn't always easy to explain, to looking for content that could be put in a PowerPoint presentation so you could explain it to someone who knew nothing about the entertainment industry and they would get it. And that's why we've seen such a run of remakes and repurposings and sequels and all of this other stuff. It was simply a matter of doing what is easy, because certainly looking for what is good is difficult. There's another issue behind all of this that no one talks about, and it seems tertiary and it seems ridiculous, but it's really key. And that is, in the 1980s, AIDS ran through Hollywood. And one of the tragedies of the AIDS epidemic is it took out a generation of development executives who understood that while Hollywood pretended it was about tough men and pretty women, it was actually about the opposite, i.e. tough women and pretty men. And they knew how to explain why a Sally Field or a Meryl Streep movie could be a hit. And I know we laugh and we giggle about that, but it's true. Because when you're talking to someone who does not appreciate that kind of diva-like quality of actresses who weren't traditionally beautiful, but yet were the reason why most people would go to see movies endlessly, you needed that perspective. And when that perspective was removed, it was a problem, because you now had people who did not quite understand that kind of quirky quality, that kind of outsider's vision that's necessary to create a bonding experience between the spectator and the spectacle. I know that's very film schooly, but that was another issue. So now we come into the present, and we look at the number one problem with streaming that everyone should know because it's obvious, but most people don't pay attention to. When Netflix was the only game in town and it controlled everything, who cared? You had a one-stop shop that had it all. But now that everyone is splitting into multiple different areas and every single streaming company is having endless amounts of content that are available when people want them without the benefit of having a schedule. What's the benefit of having a schedule? It is that you have told people what they should watch when they should watch it. It also means that you can have a separation between your good stuff, because people are fairly passive when they're watching TV and they're switching from one program to the other. They're channel surfing. They're not really engaged 100% on every single thing that they're watching, nor do they care to be. So in the process of doing that, in the process of having multiple different channels on, that with a lot of B content, as people are channel surfing between the different channels, they'll run into something that's B level and they'll watch it and they'll stick with it. When they can choose between all the A product, that's all they're going to want to watch. And here's the problem. There isn't that much A product. I know that sounds ridiculous when we think that the film industry's been around for almost a century and a quarter, but there really aren't that many good movies and TV shows from the past that people really want to watch now. And you start splitting that up, not on one place, but on among 5 or 6 different platforms, and now you're having a shortage of great shows. You are having people run out of good content almost immediately. Look at what is happening with Disney Plus. Let's get real here. Now, I'm not saying that Disney Plus is in any kind of trouble, because I don't believe it is. But how many great classic movies does Disney have in its animation portfolio? Not that many. You can blow through that in a month. Secondly, how many old shows does Disney have? Now, for me, looking at Disney Plus, there's this wonderful opportunity to revisit The Ugly Dachshund and The Absent-Minded Professor and The Computer Wore Tennis Shoes and other things that I grew up with. And I can also watch reruns of things that were on The Wonderful World of Color, The Wonderful World of Disney. But is there somebody who's younger who would have any interest in that? So what we're doing is we're creating a channel that's basically there for grandparents and for young kids. And the young kids are probably not going to be that interested in what the grandparents want to watch. Thank God they want to watch the same thing over and over again, because that makes that part of it at least somewhat easy. But it's still a challenge. Look at what happened with Lady and the Tramp recently. We all know that they wanted to release that theatrically. But you take one look at the trailers for it and you see what a cluster F it is, and how it was a travesty of the original. And that's what they're having to do. What is Disney Plus going to do when Mandalorian ends to those people who are not grandparents or don't have kids? Now, admittedly, that's not that big a population, but certainly that's the population that everyone in Hollywood wants to hit. Further, we have this attitude among people in Hollywood that sucks, and that is that they don't like half the country. They are willing to bash half of the population. Now, I'm not going to get into politics here, but that's a stupid thing to do. When you allow your talent to go out there and say, well, I don't even want Trump supporters as my audience, and then you have a movie released and it fails, you got no one to blame but yourself. You have got to be appealing to most of the country, and that means, in old Hollywood terms, you shut the F up. You don't shoot your mouth off and insult part of your audience. You might disagree with them, but you do it in a way that can be monetized. Trust me, when Jane Fonda was doing her stuff at LA Valley College, yes, that's exactly where it was shot, the place where I'm teaching right now. When she and Donald Sutherland were doing their stuff, trust me, the publicity guys knew how to monetize it. They knew that someone who was from the silent generation wasn't going to see a Jane Fonda movie, but they knew that the baby boomers, who were a huge chunk of the audience, would. So they went to it. Now, we're looking at Netflix now having all of its legacy content little by little being pulled by other studios. Disney Plus has the advantage of having both the Fox titles and the Disney titles, so they can survive quite a while on their remnants. But with Netflix, with CBS and Paramount pulling their stuff apart, and HBO having its own stuff, they're SOL in terms of old content. And as we discussed earlier, they're also SOL in terms of their new stuff not quite working. So what is Netflix going to do? I'm not saying they're going to go away, but I'm saying that they have to really rethink the way they've been doing business and figure out a way to cut their losses. So I'm going to say that the entertainment industry right now is entering a period where there is going to be chaos. We have what's going on with the Writers Guild, where they are fighting the agencies, and particularly the agencies' ability to be producers in direct violation of the MCA decrees of the 1960s. When MCA bought Universal, Lew Wasserman for a while thought that he would populate the Universal movies with all of his MCA people, and every other studio said, oh, no, you're not. And the MCA decrees were founded that said that a talent agency could not make films or TV shows. Now, we all know that the big five agencies have become even more mafioso than they were in the 80s, which was pretty bad, because they ran a lot of independent companies out of business during that period. But they're in a much stronger position now. And what Endeavor tried to do is they tried to do an IPO where they said they were going to make films, and the SEC, thank God, said, no, you're not. That's a violation of the law. And they were like surprised. And I said, what were your lawyers thinking? That you could just bribe the federal government the way you can bribe Sacramento out here to ignore a law? No. So clearly that particular plan went awry. But they're still trying to do it. Now, there's been confusion because the Writers Guild also tried to get packaging fees gotten rid of, and that was thrown out. I'm sorry, that train's left the station 20 years ago. If you wanted to make that happen, to really stop packaging from happening, you had to have done that in the 80s and 90s. It's too late now. So unfortunately, that's created confusion because now people think that the Writers Guild suffered a defeat, but they didn't suffer the defeat on the main thing they were trying to go after. So we got a problem there. We also have a problem with a lot of sequels completely bombing out. Look at what happened with Game of Thrones. Look at what happened with the most recent Star Wars movies. With Game of Thrones, I know what happened here. We have HBO in the process of being part of the Warner Brothers buyout by at&t. And certainly, to take on a huge amount of money that would be required to do another season of Game of Thrones was not something they wanted to put on their books. They needed to look like they were trying to control their costs. And instead, and this I blame the president of HBO for not going and say, what the hell are you guys talking about? You realize that we are trying to slam 2 to 3 seasons worth of plot into one season. That means that we are running the risk of creating a terrible last season. And if we create a terrible last season, you can say goodbye to any sort of residuals coming out of the previous seasons of Game of Thrones. Because if it ends badly, people won't want to see it again. Because it's a continuing show. It's not like Friends where each episode was a standalone. And instead, they went ahead and made this screwed up last season. And sure enough, there's no one who's talking about wanting to watch all of Game of Thrones again. And it's just like what happened with Sopranos. Yes, the end of Sopranos, you can now argue that it was a genius, open-ended thing, or that, no, he was really shot. Bottom line is it pissed everyone off, and it therefore killed any chances at that point of doing any sequels or doing any kind of later follow-up feature films. Okay, now they're doing a flashback to the beginning, and that's another disaster waiting to happen. I hope it's not. I hope it's like Better Call Saul, but we can't hope for that. And of course, look at what happened with Star Wars. That after The Last Jedi, this was their chance to do a Hail Mary pass, and this is where you need a David O. Selznick or a jerk as a producer who is running the show. You need someone who can go in there and say, damn it, we're going to do this right. We pissed people off with The Last Jedi. We need to redo it. But who do you have in charge? You have wusses in charge. You have Kathleen Kennedy, who I swear slept her way to the top now. And of course she did. She married Frank Marshall, right? But look at Noises Off, which is really kind of like first movie she and Marshall did apart from Amblin. And it's a mess. And you can tell it's a mess because as creative producers, they were great line producers. They didn't understand that you have to have a creative vision and not listen to everyone. You have to have a single-minded sense of it's my way or the highway. Because if you don't have that visionary push behind you, you're going to make a mess because it's going to have everyone's ideas. Everyone is going to give their contribution. And that's exactly what happened with The Rise of Skywalker. You have a movie that tries to satisfy those who like Rian Johnson. You have a movie that's trying to satisfy the pissed off fans. You have J.J. Abrams, who can't end anything, trying to come up with an ending for something that's a 40-year saga. It was never going to be easy to get this right. But certainly to go out there and to be mealy-mouthed about it was worse. I mean, okay, I think The Last Jedi is an absolute disaster, but Rian Johnson had a vision, and that was destroy everything that had come before. And he did. He did exactly what he said. And because of that, you have a lot of people who champion Last Jedi as their favorite of the Star Wars movies, period. And it will, I'm telling you, it's going to have a cult following in the future where people think it's a lost masterpiece. And as horrifying as that is now, it's because, yes, he did destroy it, but it was single-minded and definitely a tourist in approach. So look at what we've done. We've had two of our biggest IPs come crashing to earth. And then let's not even mention what's been going on with things like the new Terminator film and the redo of Charlie's Angels. Why even bother? So we're looking at an industry that is desperately in need of jerks. It's desperately in need of someone who can go in there and be a visionary, not someone who's just good at PowerPoint presentations and pitch decks. We need someone with that entrepreneurial spirit who can take a lower budget film and make it work. And guess what? We've seen it. We've seen it with movies that I don't even like. You know, we have Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, which is a celebration of everything that Hollywood says it shouldn't be. It's all about white people who are toxically male. And it's all about redemption and all of that. And look at the box office it had. Look at Joker. You're seeing a guy who's frustrated with the way the world is, and he's lashing out against it. And look at the box office it's gotten. Look at the new Adam Sandler movie, same thing. So we're seeing examples where that entrepreneurial spirit is coming back. What we have to be careful of is that the industry is very protective right now of not fixing the problem. And you might say, what are you talking about, Dan? Why wouldn't they want to fix it? Because to fix it means that you have to admit that you've been doing something wrong. And you're dealing with big egos in Hollywood. And yeah, a big ego is going to say, I would rather go down in a shower of feathers than admit I was wrong. Look at how Robert Iger has been behaving on top of Disney. On the one hand, you can point out that he had most of the top films of the year and the studio looks very strong. But it's not being led by someone like Walt or even someone like Michael Eisner, who did the Disney Renaissance with Katzenberg back in the 80s. We're not dealing with someone who loves movies and TV. We're dealing with someone who hates his audience and is contemptuous of it. He looks at them as idiots. And he's surrounded himself with people who feel the same way. And ultimately, that comes through. And that's eventually going to harm the company. Look at what they did to Marvel Comics. Look at some of the obsession with trying to force Brie Larson caused for the Marvel stuff. And now that they're done with the Avengers series, what's the guarantee they're not going to screw that up the way they screwed up Star Wars or the way that Game of Thrones was screwed up? Fortunately, again, look at what Mandalorian. Mandalorian, we got people who love the Star Wars franchise, and they're doing their best to revitalize it. So I always have hope in the industry. It's always worse than it's ever been, but it's going to need to once again really put its money where its BS is. And part of that is the diversity push. Now, they're doing the diversity push, I believe, totally wrong because it's pandering. Rose Tico, for example, is a character only someone who has no Asian friends could love. It's not a character that any Asian who's not completely in thrall with having to say the right thing for their teacher could possibly like. It's an insult to all of our Asian traditions, and most of the stuff that's coming out from any of the minority communities has an element of supreme cringe because it's being done in the form of the Caucasian, rich, suburban view of that minority. Pandering, not threatening, but pandering. treating those of us who are non-Caucasians as if we're little kids who need to have the great savior come and protect us. And that's where money is being left on the table. There are so many entrepreneurial non-Caucasians and women who are coming out of the community college or coming out of not the elite places, who have that vision, who have that passion. My high school students have made movies that are passionate and in focus. My community college students have done the same. So I see it. And yet these are the people who are having the biggest trouble because they don't have the right bling. If the industry wants to recapture its glory, it has to go after the people who don't have the bling, who can't show up driving the right car all the time, who can't necessarily wear all the right clothes or speak exactly the talk that woke Twitter says that they must. I have hope for the future. And to Rob and Soren, we have another renaissance that we can still observe in this lifetime. And I'm telling you, we're going to see it. But in order for us to see it, our youngsters have to have the courage to just push forward. And I think, fortunately, that they will.
Wouldn't it be lovely if we were old? We'd have survived all this. And everything would be easy and uncomplicated. The way it was when we were young.
Katie, it was never uncomplicated.